My name is Clara Whitmore, 31 years old. The first time the word shame attached itself to me, I wasn't even old enough to spell it. In Wharton, Texas, that word wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was spoken aloud, sharp as broken glass, carried on my father's voice for everyone to hear. Frank Whitmore, a man people called hardworking and stubborn, had a habit of turning his opinions into public declarations, especially when they involved his only daughter. At the church barbecue, when smoke from the pits curled into the summer sky, he'd slap his buddies on the back, lean on his paper plate, and say, "That girl of mine, trouble, nothing but trouble." Laughter always followed, even when some of it was nervous, even when a few people shifted in discomfort. But the joke stuck. At the 4th of July parade, with flags snapping and children running wild with sparklers, he found an audience again. "You see Clara over there?" he'd mutter, jerking his chin in my direction. "Doesn't know what she's doing with her life. Shame, that one." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't care if I heard. Even in the aisles of the H-E-B grocery store, while my mother compared prices on canned beans, he'd grip the cart and smirk to whoever was nearby. "This one will never amount to much." His tone made it sound like prophecy. And when the prophet is your father, people believe him. That became my introduction to the world. A girl defined by the ridicule of the man who raised her. My brothers, Michael and Daniel, were spared this treatment. They were his pride, his shining examples. Michael worked at the county office, neat shirts tucked into pressed jeans, always shaking hands with the right people. Daniel took up Dad's construction business, sunburned and broad-shouldered, hammer swinging like he'd been born to build fences under the Texas sun. And me? I didn't fit the mold. I wasn't content with backyard football games or pickup trucks. I wanted something more, though at 12 years old, I couldn't even name what that was. But I knew this. I didn't want to inherit my father's scorn. The thing about ridicule, though, is that it sinks deep. It seeps into your skin like secondhand smoke, impossible to scrub off. I'd stand on Richmond Road on a hot July day, the asphalt shimmering under the Texas sun, cicadas humming in the oak trees, and I'd try to convince myself that I wasn't what he said I was. I'd pedal my bike with no hands, hair flying, shouting, "Watch me go!" And from the yard, Dad would shake his head. "That's not a skill, Clara. That's just foolish." His words stuck harder than the bruises when I inevitably toppled. Mom tried to counterbalance his voice. She'd tuck little notes into my school lunches. "Don't listen to him. You're strong." She'd sneak me into the garage when Dad was at work, show me how to change a spark plug on the mower, whispering that I was capable of anything. But in public, she went silent. In Wharton, wives didn't challenge their husbands, not when the man was a decorated veteran with a Purple Heart on the wall. Respect for Frank Whitmore was almost automatic. His word carried weight in barbershops and diners. But behind closed doors, that same word weighed like an anchor around my neck. I was maybe 9 or 10 when I began to realize just how different my place in the family was. Michael and Daniel could do no wrong. They'd toss a football in the yard while Dad leaned against his Chevy, grinning like he was watching generals at work. If I dared interrupt, if I tried to show him something I was proud of, a drawing, a perfect spelling test, even just a trick on my bike, he'd brush it aside with a half smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "That's nothing," he'd say. "Your brothers, now they've got a future." And I would stand there, holding my crumpled paper or wobbling on my handlebars, feeling smaller than the grass beneath my shoes. Over time, I learned not to show him anything. Not the essay I wrote that my teacher pinned to the bulletin board, not the blue ribbon I won at the county fair, not the way my heart raced when I first saw a uniformed recruiter step into our school cafeteria. Silence became my shield. If he didn't see me, he couldn't dismiss me. If I didn't speak, I couldn't give him more ammunition. But even silence had cracks. At family barbecues, he never failed to remind everyone of my supposed inadequacy. Michael carved brisket with the swagger of a man who'd never been doubted. Daniel bragged about a new truck, and Dad poured beers, laughing loud enough to fill the backyard. When conversation turned to me, he'd grin and say, "Clara, she can probably dig a ditch. Useless for anything else." Everyone laughed. I forced myself to laugh too, a hollow sound that scraped my throat raw. Mom would squeeze my hand under the table, her eyes filled with apologies she'd never say aloud. The rhythm of my life became predictable, his cruelty, their laughter, my silence. And yet, silence wasn't only defense. It was also fuel. Every word he threw at me stacked into a wall inside my chest, brick by brick, insult by insult. Behind that wall, a fire grew. I didn't yet know how I'd prove him wrong, but I clung to the certainty that one day I would. One day, he would have nothing left to laugh at. That vow didn't arrive in some dramatic moment. It settled in slowly, like dust after a storm. But by the time I was a teenager, it burned hot enough to change everything. I remember one night lying awake in my room, listening to Dad's voice drift from the porch where he and his friends drank cheap beer. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught my name. Laughter followed, thick and careless. I curled into myself, fists tight under my pillow, and whispered into the dark, "You'll eat those words, Dad. You'll choke on them one day." That was the seed. And seeds, no matter how small, grow in silence until the day they split the earth open. I didn't know it then, but my revenge had already begun. Years before the world saw my face on a television screen. Years before the town turned its head. It started in those whispered vows in the dark, in the ache of a girl desperate to be seen as more than her father's shame. And as I look back now, I realize something chilling. My father wasn't just shaping me with his cruelty. He was creating the very weapon that would undo him. By the time I reached high school, my father had already decided who I was. To him, I was a lost cause, a punchline he could recycle at every gathering. And the cruelest part? People laughed. Not because they believed him, always, but because it was easier than challenging Frank Whitmore. He had a reputation that filled the air like the scent of barbecue smoke. Thick, stubborn, impossible to escape. To most of Wharton, Frank was the war hero with the limp in his left leg, the man who once took a bullet overseas and came back with a medal on his chest. They saw grit, loyalty, a man's man. They didn't see what I saw. The cold silence at the dinner table, the smirk that cut deeper than a blade, the way his pride stretched only wide enough to fit my brother's. Michael was already working part-time at the county office, shaking hands, learning politics. Dad called him the future mayor. Daniel was swinging hammers on job sites, tanned and muscled, Dad's real man. And me? Army toys, he called it, the day I joined JROTC at Wharton High. I'd stood in front of him in a crisp new uniform, boots too stiff, seams still creased from the package. I thought maybe, just maybe, the sight of me taking something seriously would matter. He barely looked up from the kitchen table, ashtray crowded with cigarette butts, coffee long gone cold. "Waste of time," he muttered. "Your brothers will be running businesses while you're out there playing soldier." I wanted to shout, to tell him this wasn't a game, but I'd learned that arguing with him was like throwing punches at a brick wall. You just ended up hurting yourself. So I bit my tongue, squared my shoulders, and walked out the door. Silence. It was the only defense that didn't leave me bleeding. But silence has weight. At school events, I felt it pressing down like a storm cloud. During Friday night football games, when the whole town packed into Dewey Stadium, I'd march with the JROTC unit across the field. Sweat stung my eyes, drums pounded in my chest, flags snapped in the humid air. Parents clapped politely for their sons. When it was my turn, when my boots hit the turf in steady rhythm, I'd search the bleachers. And there he was, Dad, leaning against a railing, arms crossed, smirk in place. "That your girl, Frank? She looks sharp," a man once said beside him. Dad barked a laugh loud enough to cut through the drum line. "She's just playing soldier." I heard it. I always heard it. My step faltered. The boy behind me nearly collided with my heels, but I forced my eyes forward, jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth would crack. The crowd moved on. The game went on. But inside me, something splintered. Mom tried to stitch the pieces back together in her quiet way. She'd take me to the diner for coffee, slip an extra slice of pie across the booth, whisper, "He doesn't mean it, Clara. He just doesn't know how to love you the way you need." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe he had love somewhere buried under the bitterness. But love wasn't supposed to sound like ridicule. It wasn't supposed to sting every time it brushed past you. Even my brothers joined in, though their jabs came with smirks instead of sneers. One evening, I was in the driveway tightening the chain on my bike when Daniel leaned against his shiny new truck, grinning. "Sis, why don't you quit pretending? Come swing a hammer with me. Honest work." Honest work. As if the drills I ran at dawn, the push-ups until my arms shook, the blisters on my feet, were lies. I shoved past him without answering. Words wouldn't have mattered. He wasn't listening. None of them were. So I built my armor. Every cruel remark, every smirk, every laugh at my expense became another layer. On the outside, I learned to smile, to pretend the barbs didn't pierce. On the inside, I stacked those wounds into walls, high and unyielding. If they wouldn't see my worth, I would forge it alone. Still, there were moments when the weight threatened to crush me. Like at the church potluck, fluorescent lights humming, tables groaning under crock-pots of brisket and potato salad. I walked in wearing my uniform, proud of the hard work behind it. Mrs. Perkins leaned toward her friend, whispering just loud enough, "That Whitmore girl thinks she's G.I. Jane." They laughed into their paper plates. Dad didn't defend me. He never did. If anything, he fueled it. "She'll be back in 6 months," I overheard him tell Deacon Miller by the lemonade stand. "Broke and crying. Then maybe she'll learn to run the cash register like her mama." I stood just 10 feet away, a plate of peach cobbler trembling in my hands, appetite gone. That was the rhythm of my teenage years. Cruelty delivered in public, silence held in private, Mom's soft touch trying to mend what couldn't be mended. But buried under the ache, something else was forming. Resolve. A vow I whispered to myself when the lights were off and no one could hear. One day he will regret every word. One day he will see me, and not as his shame. I didn't yet know how I'd reach that day, but I could feel it waiting, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And in the quiet of my room, with cicadas buzzing outside my window and the faint hum of the town settling into sleep, I realized something important. Silence wasn't just a shield anymore. It was a weapon, and I was learning how to sharpen it. The turning point came senior year. By then, I'd grown used to swallowing my father's insults, but something inside me had shifted. I no longer wanted to endure Wharton. I wanted to escape it. It was a recruiter who lit the spark. He walked into our cafeteria in full navy blues, the kind of uniform that turned heads even among jaded teenagers. He laid out brochures on the table, glossy pages filled with helicopters hovering over black seas, divers plunging into dark waters, ships cutting across the horizon like steel giants. Most of my classmates shrugged. They had plans, college close by, oil field jobs, some just content to drift. But I sat there as if those images had been painted for me alone. My heart hammered when I saw the picture of a woman in a wetsuit leaping from a chopper. It wasn't just adventure, it was freedom. A life far from the whispers of Wharton, from my father's smirk. When I brought the brochure home, I left it on the kitchen table like a challenge. Dad sat there as always, ashtray full, coffee going stale. "The Navy?" he barked when he saw it. His laugh was sharp and bitter. "That's babysitting ships. You think you're built for that? You'll break before week 1. I didn't argue. Arguing only fed him. I just folded the brochure, slid it into my pocket, and walked away. Silence was my answer. But in my chest, something burned hotter than his ridicule. Mom found me later in my room, staring at the folded paper like it was a map out of hell. She sat beside me, pressed a small rosary into my hand. "Don't let his words be the last thing you hear," she whispered. That night I decided. The day I shipped out for boot camp, the Greyhound bus smelled of vinyl seats and diesel. The windows rattled as the town shrank behind me. Flat fields, peeling billboards, the VFW hall, where Dad nursed beers and told jokes at my expense. He wasn't there to see me off. "Work at the yard," Mom said, though we both knew the truth. He didn't want the spectacle of watching me leave. Mom hugged me so tightly I thought she'd crack my ribs. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered, eyes wet. I clutched the rosary in my pocket as the bus rolled forward. I told myself I'd never look back. Deep down, I knew I always would. Boot camp stripped away whatever softness I still carried. Great Lakes greeted me with cold mornings sharp enough to cut, instructors who shouted until their throats bled, drills that left muscles screaming. My boots blistered my heels. My lungs burned with every lap, every push-up. But here's the truth. I welcomed it. Every insult my father had ever thrown at me turned into fuel. His voice rang in my ears when the instructors screamed, when they told me I'd never make it. "You'll break before week 1. I pressed my palms into the dirt, pushed through another rep, and muttered under my breath, "Not today." There were nights I collapsed onto the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, too tired to move. Letters from Mom arrived with photos of the backyard oak in summer, her neat handwriting urging me to keep going. From Dad, nothing. The silence stung sharper than the drills, but it also hardened me. When other recruits rang the bell and quit, I thought of him back in Wharton, beer in hand, repeating that tired joke about his daughter pretending to be a soldier. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Silence became my ally once more, not just defense this time, but strength. Because every mile I ran, every blister I endured, every bruise I wore was proof that I wasn't breaking, proof that his words were lies. And though I didn't yet know it, those lies would one day collapse in front of him, crushed beneath the weight of truth. Coronado Beach looked beautiful in the brochure, sunset spilling gold across the Pacific, surfers carving waves, palm trees swaying. But the Navy has a way of turning beauty into hell. For me, that stretch of sand became a crucible. Bud's training, basic underwater demolition, the place where men, because almost everyone was a man, arrived thinking they were tough, and most left broken. Out of 120 recruits, only a fraction would make it through. From the very first day, the instructors tore us down to nothing. Hit the surf, they barked, and we plunged into water so cold it felt like knives against the skin. Salt burned in my throat, my nose, my eyes. We locked arms, waves pounding our faces, while instructors paced the beach. "Plenty of room in the bell if you want to quit," they shouted. That brass bell gleamed at the edge of camp, each clang another dream abandoned. I watched strong men, broad-shouldered, cocky, stumble out of the surf and ring it. 1, 2, 10, gone. Their silhouettes disappeared into the night, heads bowed. Every time my body shook, every time I thought my bones would splinter from the cold, I saw my father in Wharton, leaning at the bar, laughing. "She'll never last. She'll be back in 6 months." I clenched my jaw until my teeth rattled and whispered, "Not me." Hell Week nearly destroyed us. 5 days, almost no sleep, drills that blurred into nightmares. We crawled through mud at 3 a.m, rifles clutched to our chests, waves crashing against our helmets, sand stuck to every inch of our bodies until we were raw, bleeding. My arms trembled so badly I thought they'd detach from my shoulders. I hallucinated once, saw headlights in the dark where there were none. Men around me collapsed mid-crawl, too exhausted to continue. Medics dragged them away. But I kept moving, inch by inch, because every time my body begged to quit, I heard my father's voice. "You'll break before week 1. That voice should have crushed me. Instead, it became fuel. By the end of Hell Week, there were 22 of us left, out of 120. We stood on the beach, uniforms soaked, muscles quivering, faces hollow. The instructors pinned the trident to our chests. My hand shook as I saluted, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of what it meant. I had earned it. Lieutenant Commander Clara Whitmore, U.S. Navy SEAL. For a moment, standing there with the Pacific wind whipping my hair, I felt the kind of pride I used to dream my father might give me. But he wasn't there. He never would be. Instead, I carried that pride quietly, folded it deep inside, next to the silence I'd worn since childhood. That silence, I realized, wasn't emptiness. It was power. And with every bruise, every blister, every ounce of blood I left in the surf of Coronado, that power grew. Because what my father didn't understand was this: he hadn't broken me. He'd built me. War has a way of stripping you bare. Whatever you think you are, the battlefield finds out the truth. For me, Afghanistan was the first test. Winter there bites harder than any Texas frost. Snow swept across mountains, so steep they seemed to scrape the sky. Our boots crunched through drifts that swallowed the ankles, rifles heavy in our hands. The wind howled through valleys like a living thing, carrying echoes of gunfire miles away. We marched through villages with mud walls and hollow-eyed children who watched us pass. Sometimes they waved. Sometimes they didn't. You learned quickly not to mistake silence for safety. I remember the first firefight like it happened an hour ago. The staccato crack of AK-47 rounds, the sand kicking up in angry sprays, my heart hammering as we hit the dirt. Training took over. Sight, breath, squeeze. The enemy blurred into shadows. Muzzle flashes in the distance. When it ended, the silence was deafening. 2 men on our side didn't get back up. That night, lying on frozen ground under a sky littered with stars, I felt smaller than I ever had. Yet inside, I clung to a strange calm. I was still standing. I had not broken. In Iraq, the heat became the enemy. Summer turned the air into fire. Armor seared the skin beneath it, sweat pooling, helmets baking our skulls. Dust storms rolled in without warning, turning daylight into choking darkness. We moved through ruined neighborhoods where doors could conceal bombs, where alleys could hide snipers. Every step was a question. Will it end here? But fear has no place in a SEAL's rhythm. You learn to read the twitch in your gut, to trust silence more than reports. You move, you clear, you breathe. My team didn't care that I was a woman. Not when I dragged one of them out of a firefight, blood soaking his uniform, shouting for a medic while rounds cracked overhead. Respect wasn't given, it was earned, and I earned it one mission at a time. Still, no matter how far I went, no matter how many bullets I dodged or missions I survived, one truth remained. I was fighting two wars. One against enemies who wore scarves and carried rifles, and one against the voice in my head, my father's voice. That voice found me even under foreign skies. I remember one night in Helmand Province, a blast knocked me sideways, shrapnel grazing my arm, ears ringing with the kind of high-pitched scream you don't forget. I pressed my palm to the wound, dust choking me. For a second, I thought about Wharton, about Dad at the VFW, beer in hand, telling his buddies, "Too soft, she'll never last." I forced myself to my feet. I kept moving. Later, the medic stitched me up without anesthetic. We couldn't afford noise. I gritted my teeth, didn't flinch. If pain was the price of proving him wrong, I'd pay it 1,000 times. There were rare moments of connection, though they carried their own sting. Once, comms opened long enough to call home. Mom's voice came through, soft with surprise and relief. I asked if Dad was around. She hesitated, then said, "He's at the hall." Code for, he'd rather drink with his buddies than talk to you. I swallowed hard, told her I loved her, and hung up. Then I sat in the desert quiet, stars sharp and cold overhead, and realized that the silence from him cut deeper than any shrapnel. War changes you. But for me, the hardest part wasn't combat. It was knowing that even as I fought, bled, and survived, back home, my father's laughter hadn't changed. He was still telling the joke, still calling me shame. And yet, some part of me whispered, "Keep going. One day, the joke will die, and when it does, he'll choke on the silence that follows." Christmas Eve should have felt like home. At least that's what Mom wanted for me. She begged me to come to the VFW hall that night, promised Dad would be in good spirits. She said maybe things would be different. So I put on my dress blues, polished every button until I could see my reflection. When I walked into that hall, the smell of pine garland tangled with cigarette smoke, and the jukebox hummed low with carols. I stood straighter than I ever had, shoulders back, chin high. For a moment, conversations stalled. Men paused mid-drink. Women glanced up from their card games. Some nodded with polite respect. Others stared like I was a curiosity. My heart thudded in my chest, a faint hope whispering, maybe tonight would be different. Then Dad looked up from his corner table, cards in his hand, beer sweating onto the wood. His eyes narrowed, then a grin stretched across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in," he said, loud enough for the whole hall. "My daughter, the Navy's little experiment." Laughter exploded around him. His buddies roared. Jolene, the waitress, shook her head with a smirk. Even men I barely knew chuckled nervously. My throat burned hotter than the whiskey in my glass. I wanted to stand on that table, shout at them, tell them about the nights I froze on beaches, about the endless drills, about the grit it took to wear this uniform. I wanted them to see the bruises that had shaped me, the discipline that held me together, but the words stuck in my throat. So I smiled thinly, slid into the seat beside Mom, and let the laughter wash over me. She placed her hand gently over mine under the table, her eyes shining with apology, but she didn't say anything. She never did in public. Her silence was its own kind of survival. That night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. It wasn't just Dad anymore. It was the whole town. His joke had spread like wildfire, and they'd fed it until it became gospel. At church potlucks, women whispered behind styrofoam cups. At the diner, men leaned across booths with smirks. Even kids repeated it on playgrounds. Frank's girl, the shame. And my father, the man who should have been my shield, was the one swinging the sword. When I stepped back out into the cold, the town square shimmered with Christmas lights strung across Milam Street. My boots clicked against the pavement as I headed for the bus that would take me back to base. I looked out the window as Wharton blurred past, lights fading into dark fields, and I made myself a promise. One day I'd return, not as the town's joke, not as my father's shame, but as someone undeniable, someone they couldn't laugh at. I didn't know when that day would come, didn't know what it would look like, but I felt it deep in my bones, because ridicule can only stretch so far before it snaps, and when it did, the sound would echo louder than every laugh that had ever filled that hall. It happened on a night like any other, half a world away. In Anbar province, Iraq, dust choked the air after an explosion ripped through a residential block. Half the building had collapsed, smoke curling into the night sky, screams muffled beneath the rubble. My team and I moved fast, boots pounding broken concrete, radios hissing in our ears. "Movement here!" someone shouted. I dropped to my knees, palms scraping stone, ears straining for sound. A faint cry, small, desperate, echoed beneath twisted beams. My chest clenched. I shoved my shoulder into a gap, clawing forward, lungs aching with dust. My fingers found fabric, then a tiny hand. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. Ash coated his face, his small chest struggling to rise. One shoe dangled by a torn lace. I pulled him against me, feeling how frighteningly light he was. When I stumbled back into daylight, medics rushed forward. His arms hung limp across my shoulder, his breath faint but present. That was all I cared about. I didn't see the cameras. I didn't realize the world was watching. But back in Wharton, Texas, in the smoky VFW hall, the television above the bar flickered. Dad sat in his usual corner, cards spread on the table, Lone Star sweating beside him. Pete Riley, Earl Simmons, Jolene the waitress, all the familiar faces. The smell of fryer grease clung to the air. Someone must have asked about me. They always did, sooner or later. Maybe Jolene, with her tired smile. Maybe Earl, trying to make small talk. And Dad, true to form, leaned back, raised his glass, and said, "Don't mention my daughter. She's my shame." The table chuckled, some softly, some louder. A few winced, but stayed quiet. Dad grinned, nicotine-stained teeth showing, his rhythm unbroken. Then the TV cut to breaking news. The volume rose, the anchor's voice carrying over the noise of shuffling cards. Live from Anbar Province, Lieutenant Commander Clara Whitmore of Wharton, Texas, credited with pulling multiple civilians from the wreckage. The screen sharpened. There I was, dust streaking my face, hair plastered with sweat, a limp child in my arms. My helmet came off as I shouted for the medics, my expression fierce, unyielding. The room froze. Pete's beer stopped halfway to his lips. Earl's jaw slackened, his cigarette trembling between 2 fingers. Jolene dropped her rag behind the counter, her mouth parting in disbelief. And one voice, shaky but clear, broke the silence. "Holy, that's her." The words cut the air sharper than any blade. Dad's grin faltered. His glass clinked too hard against the table. His face drained of color, eyes locked on the screen as if he couldn't look away. For once, he had no line ready, no smirk, no joke. Silence swallowed the hall, heavier than artillery fire. I wasn't there to witness it, but I've imagined it countless times. The neon beer lights buzzing above, the stunned faces of men who had laughed with him for years, and my father, suddenly stripped bare by truth. Because in that moment, his favorite joke died, and he couldn't laugh it back to life. That night, far away, I didn't feel triumph, not even anger. What I felt was quieter, steadier. A verdict I had known was coming all along. And in a smoky Texas bar, while the town stared at the TV, my revenge began. News travels fast in small towns. Faster than wind, faster than fire. By the next morning, Wharton already knew. At the diner, men set down their coffee cups and said, "You see Frank's girl on the news?" At the grocery store, women whispered over carts of bread and milk. He called her shame. She's saving children overseas. By Sunday, Pastor Miller worked it into his sermon. He stood tall at the pulpit, his voice carrying across the pews. Even a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. People nodded. Some glanced toward the Whitmore pew where Mom sat stiff and silent beside Dad. For the first time, the laughter was gone. It should have felt like victory, but what I felt instead was something heavier, because while the town's whispers had changed, Dad's silence had not. When I came home after that deployment, the air in Wharton was different. Faces I'd grown up with looked at me with something new: pride, awe, even apology. Kids tugged at their mothers' sleeves, whispering, That's her. Old women pressed my hands, their eyes bright with respect. I'd walk down Milam Street and hear my name spoken in tones I'd never imagined. But at the VFW, Dad still sat in his corner. Same Lone Star, same cards, same silence. He didn't make the joke anymore. That line, "Don't mention my daughter, she's my shame," had died the night the TV lit up with my face. But he didn't replace it with anything. No apology, no words at all. And somehow that silence cut deeper than the insults ever had. Because words, at least, are alive. They hit, they bruise, they linger, but silence? Silence is a void. And standing in front of him, uniform pressed, metal shining on my chest, I realized I wasn't fighting laughter anymore. I was fighting absence. I remember one moment at the diner. The waitress asked, "Is this your daughter, Frank? The one in uniform?" For years, he would have smirked, delivered the punchline. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee and said nothing. His silence hung in the air until the waitress shifted uncomfortably and walked away. Mom tried to fill the gap with a smile, but it was brittle. And me? I sat there, listening to the clink of forks and the hum of conversations that weren't ours, and thought, this isn't enough. Because revenge isn't just about shutting someone up. It isn't about ending the joke. It's about the truth being spoken aloud, undeniable, in front of everyone who once laughed. The cracks in his armor were showing, yes. The town no longer laughed with him. His buddies at the hall looked at him differently. Even Pete Riley, the old Vietnam vet, stopped chuckling when Dad opened his mouth. But cracks aren't collapse, not yet. And as much as I tried to bury it, I still wanted more. Not triumph, not applause. I wanted him to see me. Not as shame, not as silence. But as the daughter he could never deny. That reckoning hadn't come yet, but I could feel it, waiting. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be in whispers or half glances. It would be in full daylight, in front of the whole town, with no room left to hide. The letter came folded crisp, government seal pressed into the top corner. I read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure. By order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The ceremony would be held in Wharton, Texas, my hometown, the place I had sworn never to let define me, now summoning me back to pin honor on my chest. It was June, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement. The courthouse square was draped in flags, red, white, and blue folding chairs, lined up in neat rows across the lawn. The mayor fussed with his suit, sweat already darkening the fabric beneath his arms. Veterans shuffled in with canes, medals jangling softly against their jackets. Families filled the rows, children waving dollar store flags, the hum of small-town chatter weaving through the air. And me, I walked across the stage in full dress whites, heels striking wood in steady rhythm. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the square. Faces I'd known since childhood looked up at me differently now. Mrs. Perkins, who once whispered at potlucks, now dabbed tears from her cheeks. The men who used to laugh at Dad's jokes shifted in their seats, their eyes following me with respect. Even kids who barely knew my name pointed and whispered, "That's her." But my eyes sought only one face. 3 rows back, under the shade of a wide oak, sat my father. Hat pulled low, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Mom beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening. My brothers flanked him, their bodies stiff, their gazes darting everywhere but me. And around them, the town stared. Because everyone knew. They'd all heard the jokes, the punchline he repeated for years. And now they were watching him watch me. The mayor cleared his throat, voice carrying through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor one of Wharton's own, Lieutenant Commander Clara Whitmore, a daughter of this town who risked her life to save others overseas." Applause thundered again, louder this time. I stood straight, eyes fixed ahead, heart pounding like a drum. A general stepped forward, silver ribbon in his hand, for gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty. His words blurred into a hum as he placed the medal against my chest. Cool metal settled against fabric, a weight both heavy and light. The crowd rose to its feet. Flags waved, hands clapped, voices cheered. And in the midst of it all, I glanced to the oak. Dad remained seated, arms crossed, jaw tight. The men beside him, his buddies, the ones who used to laugh loudest, nudged him, whispered sharp words. Still he didn't move. His stubbornness, once his armor, now made him look small. For the first time, his silence wasn't power, it was weakness. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply stood there, letting the applause wash over me, letting his stillness carve the moment deeper than any words could. Because this wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about him. It was about truth made public, undeniable, in front of the very people who once laughed with him. My revenge wasn't a shout, it wasn't a fist. It was this, the sight of my father shrinking while the whole town stood tall around me. After the ceremony, the courthouse lawn became a celebration. Neighbors pressed forward to shake my hand. Mothers nudged children to meet me, their voices hushed with reverence. "This is Commander Whitmore. She's a hero." Little girls with sticky popsicle hands looked up at me, wide-eyed, whispering, "I want to be like you." Their words touched something tender I didn't know was still alive inside me. I bent low, smiling, signing programs, letting them touch the metal that gleamed against my chest. But even as I moved through the crowd, laughter and applause ringing in my ears, I could feel his eyes on me. Dad hadn't stood. He hadn't clapped. He sat rooted to that folding chair, arms crossed, jaw clenched, a shadow of the man who once filled rooms with his voice. His buddies gave me awkward salutes, some genuine, some strained, but he sat there, silent as stone. And for the first time, his silence wasn't aimed at me. It trapped him. Later, at the diner, the celebration spilled into booths and counter stools. Kids waved flags, teenagers snapped photos for Facebook, old women pressed pies into my hands. Mom sat across from me, smiling so wide it softened years of quiet suffering. My brothers hovered at the edges, offering stiff congratulations, unsure of where they fit now that the old family order had shattered. Dad didn't come, and I realized I didn't need him to. That night, in my childhood bedroom, I laid the silver star on the dresser. The pale yellow walls hadn't changed, though the posters were long gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence fill the room, but this time it wasn't his silence. It was mine. I thought about knocking on his door, demanding the words I once longed for. "Are you proud? Do you see me now?" But I knew if I asked, it would mean I still needed the answer, and I didn't. The truth was already written, not in his voice, but in the applause of a town that once laughed, in the salutes of men who once echoed his jokes, in the wide eyes of children who saw a future in me, not a punchline. That was enough. The next morning, I walked through town in plain clothes, just jeans and a t-shirt. No uniform, no medal. People still stopped me. The clerk at the gas station tipped his hat. A group of kids waved from the park. Old neighbors smiled, their eyes shining. Respect wasn't pinned to my chest anymore. It lived in me. I passed the VFW hall. The door stood open, smoke drifting out. Laughter rose from inside, but it wasn't his. For the first time, the sound didn't sting. The hall wasn't a threat anymore. It was just a place I'd outgrown. Back at the house, Mom was kneading bread dough, her hands steady, her eyes brighter than I'd ever seen. She looked up when I came in, her voice soft. "He hasn't said a word since yesterday. Not to me, not to anyone." I nodded. That silence was its own confession. Because an apology wouldn't have undone the years. It wouldn't have erased the jokes, the ridicule, the long nights I spent wondering if I mattered. Words couldn't fix what had already hardened into scars. But the truth had already spoken louder than him, and it would echo longer than his silence ever could. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it's as quiet as a medal gleaming on a dresser, as steady as a salute from a man who knows what it cost, as simple as walking past your father's chair without needing his gaze. That was my victory. Not loud, not vengeful in the way movies might show it, but real. Even now, years later, I can still see that June day in Wharton, the flags snapping in the heat, the crowd rising to their feet, and my father, arms crossed, shrinking while the whole town stood tall around me. He never apologized, never looked me in the eye and said, "I'm proud of you." For a long time, I thought I needed that, thought I'd carry the weight of his silence forever. But I don't. Because the real change didn't come from him. It came from me. From the girl who once rode her bike, no hands down Richmond Road, desperate for approval, to the woman who stood on that courthouse stage, no longer needing it. So here's the lesson I carry, the one I'll leave with you. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud. It isn't shouted across a courtroom or carved into a will. Sometimes it's as quiet as living the life they swore you couldn't. Sometimes it's letting the truth stand taller than the lie. If you've ever carried words that cut deep, if someone in your life told you you were less than you are, remember this. Their laughter doesn't define you. Your silence, your persistence, your dignity, that's where the power lies. I am not my father's shame. I am not his joke. I am what I built, step by step, through sweat and silence and unyielding will. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never let someone else's bitterness be the final word on your life. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it just waits. And when the time comes, it speaks louder than anything else ever could.